Hey, it's Bird. I've been getting a lot of comments and DMs and things about my coloring, and it's actually a pretty quick method, so I thought I'd do a step-by-step process video for you guys. Quick disclaimer before we begin, this isn't a video about how I choose my colors, nor is it one about how to use a drawing program. This is just going in with the assumption that you already know the basics of digital art. I do use Photoshop for my drawing, but I think lots of my methods and techniques can be transferred to other programs. You just might have to look for brushes that will work in similar ways. Okay, so diving right in, I start by laying out my flats. You'll see on the right side of the screen in my layers section, I organize my folders with the line art on top, and then I create a new folder for my flats or base colors. The first layer we make in this folder is skin. The next 2 to 3 layers I typically save for objects or clothing, and I make them all separate because things like the white of his shirt I don't want touching the blue of his jacket. On top of those layers, I do the whites layer, as I call it, and that's for the whites of your eyes or teeth. The next one on top, I usually label eyes, and that's for the iris, and sometimes I do like the inside of the mouth or tongue if they're smiling or have their mouth open talking or something. On top of that, I do my final layer typically, and that would be hair. So our first clipping layer we're going to add is above his hair in this case. I usually don't need to use a layer here, but because Luca has the tips of his hair dyed, this is a special case. So I go in and I take a default brush and add the blue tips, and then I go in with a softer kind of airbrush to smooth out the transition between his natural hair color and the dyed tips. The next clipping layer we're going to add is above the whites of his eyes. So I go in with typically a soft airbrush, low opacity, and I just make it more kind of 3D look to it. I go in with a really dark brush, not quite black, but usually in a shade of red. In this case I think I use blue, but yeah. Next we go and make a clipping mask over the eye layer, and I just kind of use the color slider and go from the base color to a really dark color of that. In this case it's dark blue, and then I go lighter and lighter down the eye, so it just makes a soft gradient. The final clipping layer we make in the flats group will be for the skin. So for my skin I have a certain brush I use. I'll link below the brush pack I got it from. But you can probably use any really soft brush. I don't think it makes that big of a difference. I lower the opacity to like 30%, really low, and I make my brush a kind of soft red, not super saturated and not super dark either. And I'll go over places like the cheeks, ears, beneath the chin, fingers, shoulders, knees, and stuff like that, and I'll just give it a really soft shade. Because this still isn't really well blended, I'll go over to the layers opacity and play with it until I get it to a spotted like. If they're actually like a flustered or embarrassed character, I'll usually leave it a bit darker just to give them more of a blush rather than just some life to their cheeks and stuff. Now that we're all done with our flats, you can close up that folder group, and we're going to make another one to throw it into. And this just keeps it so that for a later step where I combine the drawing and stuff like that, it just makes it easier to move all the folders and files around. So we have this new group with their folder for the flats inside it. You can label it whatever you want. I usually just go like colors or combo or something like that. And we're going to make a clipping layer above our flats folder. And I usually go and make just another layer below that clipping mask so that each new layer I add will just automatically be a clipping layer instead of having to right click and continuously remake them all into clipping layers. Okay, so this is where I start going with my shading, and I have a certain textured brush I use. Unfortunately, the artist deleted all their files, including the brush set I have a few brushes from off their DeviantArt. I'll try to make my own brush set and maybe upload it and post a link below in the description. However, some of these brushes I use are custom brushes from certain sets that people made themselves, so I'm not sure if I can use or re-upload all of these brushes. I'll try my best, but if I can't, you can probably find other alternatives to these brushes. You don't have to use these specific brushes. I honestly don't think brushes make that big of a difference. For this one I go in with like 70 to 80% opacity, and I use a red tone. not very saturated and not super dark. And I'll go over the drawing and just add shading where I want. Not very much on the skin specifically, mostly just the places where you see my hatching. So around like under the eyebrows, under the eyes, on the cheeks and stuff, the tip of the nose, under the chin, ears and stuff like that. I just add some shading there for the skin. Otherwise, I usually focus here on the hair and the clothing, just adding where I think my shadows would be. I don't honestly know very much about lighting and stuff, so don't use me as a reference, but this is just for the technique I use, so go for it. So once I'm done laying down the shading, I go and make that layer a multiply layer. And you'll see me adjust like the opacity again, just playing with it to where I want. In this specific drawing, I didn't like how the red shading kind of muddled up the drawing because it's very cool colors. So I actually made the opacity really low, and then I went in with a new layer, basically the exact same but with a blue brush, and just over certain parts to make it darker. And then I messed with the opacity again to get it to where I wanted. Using the same brush, we're going to go in with almost white. Usually I use a hue of like pink or an orange. And we're going to add highlights. This time I do not touch the skin at all. I only go on the hair and clothing. We're going to set that layer to overlay, and then we're going to mess with the opacity. Okay, so next we're going to make our brush a solid white, and we're going to up the opacity to 100%. I'm going to go in with Loish or Losh, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, her oil pastel brush. So basically a brush with a really rough texture. And I just go in and make my highlights on the hair. And for this, I use an overlay layer. And I lower the opacity really low after this. I really want a subtle look with this highlight. Basically the exact same thing. I go over the iris and add some streaks. And just highlights. Sometimes I do dots, sometimes I do more detailed effects. Usually though, I just do some hatching across it. And I leave the overlay on that pretty high, but I still bring it down the opacity a bit. So quickly, I'll take that same solid white brush and I'll jump to the line art folder and create a new layer above my line art and just add the whites highlights in the eyes. Okay, so now we're going to go back to our folder that contains the flats and back to our massive collection of clipping layers that we made, and we're going to make a new one. And for this we're going to use an airbrush and set it at like 100% opacity, whatever. We're going to go in and make a gradient from dark blue to red to yellow. And this is just a technique I picked up from seeing other artists do it. I'm not really sure why or whatever, but I do like the effect it has. And so we're gonna do that, and then I set that layer to soft light. You can probably do overlay as well, but you might have to lighten the opacity. So soft light, and I still really lighten the opacity. I think I do this one to, how light do I do it? Like 27%, something around there, like really light. The next thing we're gonna do is make one big master folder basically that's gonna contain our folder with all the coloring of Luca, and then the folder with all our background coloring. This folder is going to have two overlays, the first of which is a white speckle brush, and fortunately I can't link you to that one because it's from the discontinued set. So you can probably find your own or make your own, whatever, just a speckle brush to add texture. So we're going to go in, cover the drawing with speckles, and set that to overlay, and then lower the opacity way down to like 7 to 12% probably. And we're going to make a new folder, or new layer on top of that, and do the same thing but with black instead, and just mess around with the opacity to get the texture look you want. Next, you'll see me jump to my line art folder, which is still above this master group. So basically we have two folders at that point. We have our line art folder and then our colors folder. And our line art, we're going to go to it and add a clipping layer above it and turn it to a really dark red. Play around with different colors you want. I don't always use red. I typically use a dark shade of red though, but sometimes I use purple. Sometimes I do it based on each individual part of the drawing. But yeah, you can do that and then set the line art itself, like not that layer, but the line art, to multiply. Okay, so now we're going to be happy that we made all these folders because now that we have these two folders, the line art and all our colors, we're gonna put them into a new folder that I usually title something like original, and I lock that folder so that I do not lose it, and I duplicate it, and then I merge it. So now that we have an entire copy of our entire drawing merged together, just one flat image, I create a new folder so that any adjustments I make, I can just merge the group after, and it's just easier that way. Because this is Photoshop, you might not have all the adjustment features I have, but usually you can have a brightness and contrast saturation bar on most programs, and you can just mess with that, tweak it how you want. Maybe you don't even need to tweak it at this point. I usually do just to play around and see if I can improve it at all. As well, I usually do a filter to make it warmer. I really want to make my colors warmer, and I think you can do this on different programs. This one, Photoshop actually has a filter option with like different set filters already set up, and I usually go into the orange or the reds or the warm filters and just play around with how dense it is. But you can probably get the desired effect on any art program just by going and making an overlay or a soft light layer of like a warm orange or red or whatever, and then just playing around with the opacity. I'm pretty sure you can get the same effect. And the final step I basically do is I go around with the blur tool and I'll just blur the edges of my drawings. Certain parts that are further away that I want less focus drawn to, and I'll just blur those really lightly. Not so much that they're like muddled or gross, but just so that really subtle. And in this case, I actually use Photoshop's blur filters. I don't always do that, and you don't need to. I just wanted it for the specific drawing to try it out and experiment with it, play around. But you can still get the same, like if you want a focus lens kind of effect, you can still just do a really hard blur with just a normal blur tool if you don't have the filter option on your program. And you can just go really hard blur and then go softer as you go in to the middle or center of your drawing. And for my signature, if you really care, I basically go in with a text tool, write out my signature. I go in with the selection tool and add a white bubble and lower the opacity and just throw it around the drawing until I find a place that it fits. You can do this if you want, sign it yourself. It doesn't make a difference to me. Alright, so that's it for this video. I hope it was helpful to someone. It went on longer than I intended, but it was hard to condense all my steps and talk everything through in a way that I thought wouldn't be confusing. If you have any questions about anything, be sure to ask below and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. If you'd like to see more tutorial videos like this one, be sure to give it a thumbs up and maybe even suggest something for next time. Thanks for tuning in.